On the outskirts of a sleepy rural town, the old Miller farm lay in the shadow of the forest. The farm had been in the Miller family for generations, its fields rich and fertile, yielding bountiful harvests year after year. However, the land held a dark secret, one that had been carefully guarded and whispered about in hushed tones. As the years went by, the whispers grew louder, until the Miller farm became a place of both reverence and fear. Thomas Miller, the current owner, was a pragmatic man who had little patience for superstition. He had inherited the farm after his father's sudden and mysterious death, and he was determined to make it thrive. Despite the eerie tales that surrounded the property, he worked tirelessly, maintaining the fields and tending to the animals with a single-minded focus. But as the annual harvest moon approached, a sense of unease began to settle over the farm. The harvest moon was a time of celebration for the townsfolk, marking the end of the harvest season with feasts and festivities. For the Millers, however, it was a time of dread. According to legend, the farm was cursed, and every year under the light of the harvest moon, something dark and malevolent would rise from the earth. Thomas had always dismissed these stories as nonsense, but as the fateful night drew closer, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. One evening, as Thomas was finishing his chores, he noticed a strange sight in the field. A circle of crops had been flattened, forming a perfect ring. He frowned, puzzled by the phenomenon. The crops were healthy and strong, and there was no sign of any machinery or animal tracks. The sight stirred an old memory, a story his father had told him when he was a child. "Stay away from the circles, Thomas," his father had warned. "They're a sign, a gateway for the things that shouldn't be here." Shaking off the memory, Thomas decided to investigate. As he walked into the circle, a chill ran down his spine. The air inside the ring was noticeably colder, and the silence was oppressive. He bent down to examine the flattened crops, but as he did, he heard a low, rumbling growl. Startled, he stood up and looked around, but saw nothing. The growl came again, louder this time, and he realized it was coming from beneath his feet. Fear gnawed at the edges of his mind, but he forced himself to stay calm. "It's just a sinkhole," he muttered, trying to convince himself. "Or maybe an underground spring." He turned to leave the circle, but as he did, the ground began to tremble. He stumbled and fell, his hands sinking into the cold, damp earth. The growling grew louder, more insistent, and he felt something move beneath him. Panic surged through him as he scrambled to his feet and ran back to the house. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. The events in the field played over and over in his mind. He decided to call his old friend and neighbor Jake, a local historian who had spent years researching the town's folklore. If anyone could shed light on the mystery, it was Jake. "Jake, I need to talk to you about something strange," Thomas said, his voice trembling slightly as he recounted the events in the field. Jake listened intently, his expression growing more serious. "Thomas, I think you need to know the full story," he said finally. "The legend of the harvest moon isn't just a story. There's truth to it." Jake explained that the Miller farm was built on ancient land, once home to a pagan cult that worshipped dark, ancient gods. Every year, under the light of the harvest moon, they would perform rituals to summon their deities, offering sacrifices to ensure a bountiful harvest. When the settlers arrived, they drove the cult away, but the rituals had left a mark on the land. The circles were gateways, remnants of the rituals, and each year, the barrier between worlds grew thinner. "Those growls you heard, they weren't natural," Jake said. "Something is trying to break through, and if it succeeds, it will bring death and destruction." Thomas felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He had always dismissed the stories as old wives' tales, but now he couldn't ignore the evidence. "What do we do?" he asked, desperation creeping into his voice. Jake looked grave. "We need to perform a counter-ritual. It's risky, but it's the only way to close the gateway and banish whatever is trying to come through." The two men spent the next day gathering the necessary items: candles, salt, sacred herbs, and an old tattered book that contained the counter-ritual. As the sun set and the harvest moon began to rise, they headed to the field, their hearts heavy with apprehension. The circle of flattened crops was still there, a dark stain on the otherwise healthy field. As they stepped inside, the temperature dropped, and the air grew thick with an unnatural presence. They quickly set up the ritual, forming a protective circle of salt and lighting the candles. Jake began to chant the incantations from the book, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. As the ritual progressed, the ground began to shake violently. The growling grew louder, more menacing, and shadows seemed to swirl around them. Thomas and Jake held their ground, their voices joining in the chant, calling upon ancient powers to banish the darkness. Suddenly, the ground split open and a monstrous figure began to emerge. It was a grotesque amalgamation of twisted limbs and glowing eyes, its form shifting and writhing as it clawed its way out of the earth. The air was filled with a cacophony of screams and growls, and the stench of decay was overwhelming. Jake's voice wavered, but Thomas grabbed his arm, urging him to continue. "We can do this!" he shouted over the din. "Don't stop!" Summoning every ounce of courage, they raised their voices, the words of the incantation ringing out into the night. The creature roared in fury, its claws swiping at the air as it fought against the binding spell. The candles flickered and threatened to go out, but the protective circle held. With one final desperate effort, they completed the ritual. A blinding light erupted from the circle, enveloping the creature. It let out an ear-piercing scream as it was dragged back into the earth, the ground sealing shut behind it. The light faded and the field fell into an eerie silence. Thomas and Jake collapsed to the ground, exhausted but relieved. The air was still, and the temperature began to rise. The gateway had been closed and the dark presence banished. In the days that followed, Thomas noticed a change in the farm. The crops seemed healthier, the animals more at ease. The oppressive feeling that had hung over the land was gone. The townsfolk, unaware of the true events, marveled at the farm's sudden prosperity. Thomas, however, knew that the peace was hard won. He and Jake had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, but he couldn't forget the creature's furious eyes or the feeling of malevolence that had pervaded the air. The legend of the Harvest Moon was no mere tale. It was a grim reminder of the thin line between our world and the unknown. As the next harvest moon approached, Thomas made sure to prepare just in case. He and Jake kept the sacred items close, ready to act if needed. The Miller farm continued to thrive, but the memory of that fateful night lingered, a silent warning of the darkness that lay just beneath the surface. The town of Millstone moved on, the legend of the Harvest Moon fading into the background. But for Thomas and Jake, it remained a vivid and haunting reality. They had faced the unknown and survived, but they knew that the darkness was never truly gone. It waited, biding its time, until the next harvest moon. In the end, the Miller farm stood as a testament to the courage and resilience of those who dared to face the darkness, but it also served as a reminder of the ancient forces that lurk just beyond our understanding, waiting for the right moment to break through and reclaim their place in the world. And as long as the harvest moon rose, Thomas and Jake would be ready, standing guard over the land that had once been a gateway to a realm of nightmares. For in the quiet of the night, when the moon was high and the shadows long, the whispers would begin again, and the legend of the harvest moon would come to life once more. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video and subscribe if you want to see more of stories like this one.